I'm going to be addressing the Trinitarian controversy part 2, and as soon as I say the title, I think a lot of people would say they weren't discussing the Trinity, they were discussing the dual natures of Christ in the 5th century. Sean, what are you talking about? But let's face it, you don't really have a dual natures of Christ until you have Christ elected to be God in the 4th century. So really this is an outworking. If we think of it as the trunk of the tree being Nicaea I, the First Council of Nicaea in 325, where Jesus is considered God at the same level as the Father, then this would be another branch off that tree in the 5th century, where the fight is, how is He God and man at the same time? And so that's the theological question that really was being addressed and thought about in the 5th century. And so that's what I would like to focus on. Before I do that, I want to look at John Chrysostom. Has anyone ever heard of John Chrysostom, or is it a totally strange name to you? I never know if anybody's ever heard of any of these people, because it's not Bible, it's history. And so they are kind of strange. But Chrysostom was a very good speaker. He was classically trained in Antioch in the best education of his day. And Christos is the word for Greek, and stom is mouth. So he was a golden mouth preacher. And he was early on very much touched by God as a teenage boy. And when he lists off the sins, he says, "Oh, I lived a reprobate life. I was just totally lost before God found me." And the things he lists off are like eating too many dainties, or having an impure thought once, or something. I mean, they're totally trivial, the sorts of sin, big sins he lists off. And so he wants to serve God. And the real heroes in the old days, in the latter part of the 4th century, in the early 5th century, and throughout the Middle Ages, the rock stars of Christianity were the monks and the nuns, the ones who had sworn off sex forever. They love God with all their heart. They're not going to play the game and the system. They're going off to fight the demons and to struggle in holiness in the desert or in the woods if there wasn't a desert nearby. And so John decided he would go be a monk, and he went off into the wilderness and didn't sleep very much. One of the things you do is you don't let yourself sleep too much. You don't allow yourself any pleasure. You eat poor food, and you really strive to get your flesh under control, your sort of like appetites under your thumb, and so on. And so it's a real training program, but John's health wasn't good. It wasn't really up to it. So you can only do so many sleepless nights living in a cave before you start to, depending on what your constitution is, right? Before you start to see some serious deleterious side effects. And so John wasn't able to do the full monk thing full time. And so he came back, and he ended up becoming the pastor, or actually the bishop of Antioch. Now, Antioch wasn't a major city, but it was a city of some serious significance. I think someone asked the other day, where did this word Christian first come from? Well, it came from Antioch. In Acts chapter 11, when our people were there, they were first called Christians in Antioch. So Antioch goes way back. That was Paul and Barnabas' home base, from where they went off and did all the missionary work. It was all based in Antioch. So this is Antioch 300 years later, and John Chrysostom is the preacher there, and he's very much someone more concerned about the people than the doctrine, if we could put it that way. I don't like splitting those two things. I don't like splitting your head from your heart. I think that's a weird, recent innovation. I don't really know what it means, other than that somehow we're splitting people up. I don't like this. I'm more of a holistic person. But John Chrysostom was very concerned about people, but he did contribute some doctrinal ideas. He came up with the doctrine, and really probably wasn't the first one to come up with it, but he really popularized the doctrine of incomprehensibility. Has anyone ever bonked their head up against that one? You start to question, you say, well, hold on, you have three persons, or how about this one? God died. Just 2 words. A perfectly confusing sentence. God died. Well, hold on a second. God's immortal. So that means God not can die, because mortal means can die, right? So how does that work? And then if you ask, your Trinitarian friend about that, they'll say, well, look, Sean, it's a mystery, man. You're not supposed to be able to understand it. It's incomprehensible. And so that was really formalized by John Chrysostom. That was one of the things he contributed, with which I would love to have a conversation with him about that, because that's cheating in a conversation. It's cheating to say it's a mystery and you can't understand it and you have to believe it, because we could just say the same thing back, right? It's a mystery that God forgave our sins and that the payment wasn't, infinitely, ontologically exactly equivalent, as St. Anselm insisted in the 1,000 years ago or whatever. So John Chrysostom did contribute that, but at a certain point there were these there was another bishop of Alexandria, surprise, a guy named Theophilus. He's got kind of a nice name there, same name as the person in the book of Acts and Luke, that Luke addressed to. Same name, obviously some 100 years later. But Theophilus was using the standard Alexandrian thug tactics, really pioneered by Athanasius and some of these other bishops. And there were some monks there called the Tall Brothers. And there were 4 of them, and they were monks in the region of Alexandria. There were lots of monks in Alexandria. It was one of the best places to be a monk in the ancient world, because they had the desert there, and you had some good weather to be a monk. You don't have to worry about rain very much. And there was a real legacy ever since Anthony was a monk, for whom probably all other Anthonys derived their name. And but these guys, they weren't just monks, they were theologians too, and they wanted to study Origen. And Theophilus didn't like Origen. He thought he was just a kook, and his theological ideas were wacko. And it's probably partly right. Origen did have some pretty good ideas, but a lot of it was a little just spacey. Aliens and whatnot, pre-existent souls, falling in. It was kind of Mormon, actually. But anyhow, so he uses the standard strong-arm tactics, and he labels these guys as heretics and kicks them out of Egypt. And they're all upset. So they go up to Constantinople, which is the capital, and they lay their case before John Chrysostom, who had just recently been elevated to the position. He never would have dreamed of being the bishop of Constantinople, the patriarch of the capital city of the empire. I mean, he was kind of a meat and potatoes kind of guy. And to be elevated to this really high position so quickly, and without, he didn't even know it was coming. When the emperor decided to grab John from Antioch and install him in Constantinople, he asked him to come outside the city for a meeting, and then they threw him in a chariot and drove him up to Constantinople. That's how they did things back in the old days, because if you were too eager to gain a position, you were considered prideful. So you always would pretend, at least, that I could never do that, and then they have to force you. So that was kind of the standard back then. So John is really out of his element. He's a brilliant orator. He can handle himself in the high society, but he's just not a good. He's not good at maneuvering politically. You know what I mean? You have to be really savvy to survive as a bishop at this point in time in the big cities, because everybody has an interest and you have the power, because you're the patriarch of Constantinople. So anyhow, these 4 brothers, they come up from Egypt and they lay their case before John Chrysostom. And Chrysostom is appalled. He's like, Theophilus is really doing this sort of thing to people in Alexandria? This is wrong. And so he writes a letter to Theophilus. And Theophilus responds, mind your own business. Why are you meddling in Alexandria? Who do you think you are? These guys, they don't know anything. How dare you even hear their accusation? And so it doesn't really go anywhere. And so the Tall Brothers, what they do is they decide, hey, well, the bishop's not doing anything, so let's get the government involved. Let's talk to the emperor and the imperial family and see what they say. And so when they find out that Theophilus is using these thug tactics down in Alexandria, they get very upset, and they decide, we'll hold a council, because that's what the government always does when there's a question. They hold a committee, a council, and they try to hear everybody out, and then they make a law or something like that, make some sort of decision. And so they decide they're going to put Chrysostom as the judge presiding over the council, and they'll have Theophilus force him to come up, because you're not going to get him up to his own trial without forcing him, right? And so he comes up, and Chrysostom is intended to sit on the council. And from the moment Theophilus arrives, he's scheming, he's planning. How is he going to reverse the situation from being the accused to the accuser? And so he's planning this all out, and he gathers some people together, and I've got a few points down there. I put a lot of words on this page, huh? So the Synod of the Oak is in 403, and so he connives a way to basically accuse John Chrysostom of heresy or of some moral crimes. Of course, Chrysostom's a Boy Scout. I mean, he tried to dig up stuff on his past, but he just, like I said, his big sins were like eating too many desserts when he was a teenager or something. I mean, he couldn't really find anything. But Chrysostom had persecuted some heretics and so on, and he dug up some dirt, and he was able to have this little council out by an oak tree in 403, and he condemns Chrysostom and convinces, and this is how brilliant these Alexandrians were at maneuvering political situations. He got the emperor to endorse his little synod by the oak tree and kick Chrysostom out of the city and exile him. And so the emperor goes along with it, and then the empress, who's really pulling all the strings here, a woman named Eudoxia, she says she has a miscarriage. So Chrysostom is kicked out of the city, and then she has a miscarriage right after it, and she says, God's judging me for my sin of kicking out this Chrysostom, who was never a bad person after all. And so she brings him back, and everything's supposed to be forgotten and forgiven, and Chrysostom is back there in his pulpit, and he's preaching in probably Hagia Sophia, one of these incredible cathedrals in modern-day Istanbul, which is ancient Constantinople. And he's not behaving in the way the empress wants him to behave. He's still preaching against the lavish lifestyle and so on. And so she has him ousted again. And this is after Theophilus has gone. And this time it sticks. It was about a year later, and they decide that they're going to just march him and march him and march him from town to town to town, going farther and farther away from the capital. They march him all the way out to the Black Sea. I told you already, his health was not good for these sorts of extended, exhausting exercises, like living in the cave. Even when he was a teenager, he just couldn't do it. And so they would just march him tirelessly, and eventually they marched him to death. I mean, literally to death. I mean, he would have a fever, he would be exhausted, and they would get up and say, let's march again. This is imperial soldiers marching the poor bishop there of Constantinople. And they just kept marching him until he died. And then after he died, he became even more popular than when he was alive, which is kind of amazing. But it's just so tragic, to see these sorts of things, all done by Christians to Christians. And so that just gives you a flavor for this man named Theophilus and the sort of ingenuity that these Alexandrian bishops had to get things done. And of course Theophilus wanted to get his own guy installed in Constantinople, because if you had a pro-Alexandrian bishop in Constantinople, then life would be good. He would extend his power. And that didn't happen. Instead, another bishop, a guy named Flavian, was installed by the emperor. And the story goes on. So now let's move to talk about Cyril of Alexandria. I have his dates here for you, 376 to 444. He's the nephew of Theophilus. He was there at the Synod of the Oak, and he was mentored. Just like Athanasius was mentored by Alexander. So 100 years later, now we have Cyril mentored by Theophilus, two new Alexandrian bishops. He was a prolific writer. Not only is he a saint, but he's one of the very top-notch of saints. Really the cream of the crop. He's called a doctor of the church. And if you get to be called a doctor of the church, it's an ecclesiastical title. I mean, you wouldn't even believe the list of requirements that you would have to have achieved to do that. And yet, as we'll come to see, his life was just riddled with evil behavior. It's just amazing how these people got through the system. And he really split the church.